They left him to die in the cold. No name, no blanket, just the silence of a forgotten field. But sometimes the ones who have nothing give everything. A cat who never trusted, a girl who never stopped believing, and a man who hadn't spoken to a soul in years. When their paths crossed, broken pieces began to find shape again, not because they were strong, but because they chose to stay. This is the story of Cooper of Maggs and of how mercy found its way home. Chapter 1. Mercy's Field. Autumn in Ridgeland, Colorado, was never gentle. The wind had a way of slicing sideways through the trees, carrying the scent of pine needles, cold ash, and the distant bite of snow. The town itself, population just under 3,000, sat nestled in a basin of quiet, a forgotten stretch of highway, flanked by stubborn mountains and fields gone gold with dying wheat. It was in one such field, known only by locals as Mercy's Field, where something had been left behind. Cooper lay curled into a trembling knot beneath a collapsed tent tarp half covered in dew and crushed grass. He was no older than 4 months, a golden retriever with fur meant to shine like wheat at dusk, but now clumped with mud and dried blood. His eyes, once a playful honey brown, had dimmed with exhaustion. Scratches ran along his hind legs where thorns had ripped through him, and his ribs pressed visibly against his fragile skin with every breath. Cooper didn't understand why he had been left behind. He only remembered laughter, the crackle of fire, and then silence. The group of teenagers who had fed him hot dog scraps and named him Bud for a night had packed up and driven off at dawn, leaving behind nothing but soda cans, scorched marshmallow sticks, and him. Across the field, under the rotting eaves of an abandoned feed silo, a figure stirred. She was nearly invisible against the gray of morning fog, just a shadow at first. Maggs had always been a ghost to this town, a stray cat with storm-colored fur, her coat mottled with soot dust, and the occasional smear of sap. She was small but lean, perhaps 4 or 5 years old, her green eyes keen with the intelligence of something that had watched and waited far too long. Her left ear was torn at the tip, the souvenir of a raccoon encounter, and her gait was a little uneven, but her instincts were sharp. Maggs didn't trust easily. Not people, not other animals, not the world. She had once belonged to someone. There had been a child's voice, a bowl with her name painted in blue, but that was years and storms ago. These days, she survived on what she could find and followed no one's rules but her own. It wasn't hunger that led her toward the center of the field that morning. It was the sound of faint, irregular whimper that broke the rhythm of wind and crows. She froze, tail still, ears twisting. Another whimper. The cat crept forward with calculated steps, belly close to the ground, until she reached the edge of the tarp. What she saw made her blink once, then twice. The puppy's breath came in short, panicked gasps, and though his head barely lifted, his eyes locked onto hers, not in fear, but in quiet, desperate hope. Maggs hissed softly, more out of reflex than menace, and took a step back. She could walk away. She had walked away from worse. But something about the stillness in that gaze held her. It was the same stillness that had lived in her once when she sat for days outside a shuttered house waiting for a girl who never came back. She inched forward and touched her nose to Cooper's paw. He flinched, but didn't pull away. Maggs sat beside him. She didn't know why. Perhaps because no one else had. Just over the ridge past the wire fence that marked the edge of Mercy's field, a window shutter creaked open. A pair of binoculars poked through a slit in the curtains of a moss-colored cabin, and the man behind them adjusted the focus with a slow, deliberate turn. Caleb Monroe. 52, tall and gaunt, with a beard that had long since gone to silver, hadn't looked anyone in the eye for almost 5 years. He wore flannel shirts year-round, kept his boots by the door even when it snowed, and lived on canned soup, jerky, and silence. Once a staff sergeant in the Army Medical Corps, Caleb had returned from deployment to find the world less familiar than the battlefield. The death of his wife in a car accident only months later sealed the door on what little light remained in him. He retired early, withdrew from friends, and moved to the cabin that had belonged to his grandfather, tucked on the far end of town. It was the kind of place where no one asked questions perfect for a man who had none left to answer. Caleb lowered the binoculars. The cat he'd seen before, always watching but never approaching, was now curled beside something. A dog. No. A puppy. Injured. He squinted, jaw tightening. Someone had dumped it. Again. He had seen too many strays lately, each one a reminder of just how callous the world had grown. He considered stepping outside, but his hands hesitated on the doorknob. Not yet. Instead, he reached for the can of tuna on the counter and a folded towel from the bathroom. He wasn't ready to open his door, but he could at least leave something on the porch, several miles away on the other side of Ridgeland. 12-year-old Emily Dalton finished her oatmeal with quick, efficient bites. Emily was slender, sun-kissed, with hair that always looked like it had been brushed in a hurry and freckles that seemed to multiply daily. She lived with her father Graham, a soft-spoken widower and wheat farmer who worked long hours and still made time to braid her hair before bed. Emily had her mother's curiosity and her father's quiet, but she also had a fire all her own. She walked the boundary lines of their farm every morning with a sketch pad tucked under her arm, drawing owls' fence posts, even the old scarecrow. This morning, however, something in the distance pulled her from routine. The wind carried a strange note like the sound of a whimper drifting from the edge of Mercy's field. She followed it on instinct, ducking under the fence and moving toward the collapsed tent. There, to her astonishment, was a sight she would never forget. A dirty golden retriever puppy lying motionless, and beside him a cat with eyes like green glass sitting guard like a statue. The cat turned its head and met Emily's gaze, not startled, not welcoming, just watching. Emily knelt carefully. "Hey," she whispered. "You're not supposed to be here alone." She didn't touch the puppy. Instead, she stood and ran. Not away, but home. Back at the cabin, Caleb opened the door just long enough to place the tuna and towel on the steps. When he looked up, he saw her. A small girl sprinting through the field. She wasn't running in fear. She was running with purpose. And that alone was enough to make Caleb follow. By the time Emily returned with her father's old wagon and a blanket, Caleb was already at the edge of the field, standing over the puppy. Mags stood fur-puffed slightly but didn't flee. Emily looked at Caleb wide-eyed. "Can we help him?" Caleb's voice was rusty. "We better try." Together, they lifted Cooper into the wagon, wrapping him in the soft plaid of a wool blanket. Mags leapt up and perched at the edge, her eyes still watching Caleb like she was judging his every move. Caleb didn't mind. It had been years since anything had looked at him with expectation, instead of pity. They pushed the wagon together toward the cabin as the wind picked up sweeping dust and leaves behind them. In Mercy's field, the last soda can rattled quietly in the breeze, then rolled into the ditch forgotten. Chapter 2. The Stranger with a Can. The wind had shifted by afternoon, curling through the cottonwoods like it carried messages from the mountains. Caleb Monroe leaned over the counter in his cabin's small kitchen, his elbows propped on the wood worn smooth by years of silence. He stared down at the bundle of damp fur, wrapped in his old hunting blanket, now curled in a makeshift dog bed near the wood stove. The puppy Cooper, the girl had called him, barely stirred, save for the slight rise and fall of his rib cage. His breathing was shallow but steady, and one paw twitched occasionally as if he were dreaming. Probably of warmth he'd never known. Mags, the ghost-like gray cat, had taken position by the cabin's front door. She sat stiff and alert on a folded towel Caleb had laid there earlier, her tail wrapped tightly around her body, ears half tilted back. She didn't enter farther than the threshold. Not yet. But she hadn't left either. Caleb scratched at his beard, the coarse silver hair rasping under his fingers. It had been years since another living thing had depended on him. His hands, though steady from years in the field dressing wounds and stitching skin, trembled now as he opened a can of tuna and set it gently by the towel. "That's all I've got," he muttered. "No fresh fish in this cabin." Mags didn't move at first, only blinked with measured indifference. Then, almost imperceptibly, she inched forward and began to eat. Her trust came not in leaps, but in inches. There was a knock at the door. Soft, hesitant. Caleb tensed his back, stiffening like a soldier caught without armor. No one knocked on his door. No one even came this far. He opened it slowly. Emily stood on the porch, her cheeks flushed from the walk and eyes wide with concern. She held a small paper bag in one hand. "I brought some antiseptic and gauze," she said. "And beef jerky. My dad says it's a good bribe for dogs." Caleb stepped aside wordlessly. Emily entered with the quiet reverence of someone entering a chapel, her gaze flicking first to Cooper, then to the cat still crouched near the entry. "She didn't leave," she whispered. "She hasn't yet," Caleb said. Emily knelt beside Cooper and reached out, stopping just shy of contact. "May I? He'll let you," Caleb said. "I think." Emily's touch was gentle, like a breeze skimming across the surface of a pond. She dabbed around the pup's eyes with a clean cloth, careful not to disturb the bandage Caleb had placed on his hind leg. "His name really is Cooper," she said. "Not Bud or Dogface like those kids were calling him. I saw it in his eyes." Caleb raised an eyebrow. "You can see names in eyes sometimes." From a few feet away, Mags let out a small huff. Caleb glanced toward her. "I'm not sure if she's judging us or just disapproving of everything." "She's a cat," Emily said simply. "Both." As the fire crackled, Caleb moved to the stove to warm a kettle. The routine, though unfamiliar in this context, settled into his limbs like an old uniform. He found himself asking, "How'd you know to come this morning?" Emily looked up. "I walk the boundary lines every day. Drawing mostly. I like quiet places. But Today, I don't know. I just heard something. Caleb nodded, pouring hot water over 2 tea bags. He hadn't had tea with anyone since before his wife died. He handed one mug to Emily, who accepted it with both hands like something precious. For a long time, neither spoke. Outside, the wind howled, but the inside remained still. Across the gravel road from Caleb's cabin, an old blue pickup slowed to a stop. The engine sputtered, then died, and a tall man with dusty jeans and a worn flannel stepped out. His name was Wade Cooper, no relation to the pup, a 55-year-old farmhand with calloused hands and a permanent squint from decades of working under the sun. He approached the porch with a plastic container tucked under one arm. Inside were bone scraps and a large tin of salted fish. Caleb met him halfway. "Wade." "Figured you could use this," Wade said. "Saw the girl dragging a wagon and you walking beside her. Thought either hell froze over or you got yourself into something." Caleb grunted. Maybe both. Wade was a simple man, quiet by nature but fiercely loyal. After Caleb's wife died, Wade had come by every Sunday for 6 months, always bringing coffee, never staying longer than 5 minutes. When Caleb finally stopped answering the door, Wade stopped coming, but never stopped watching from a distance. "Looks like you've got a full house now," Wade said, peering inside the door where Emily sat cross-legged and Cooper dozed. "Need anything else?" Caleb hesitated, then nodded toward the canned goods shelf. "If you've got spare kibble or soft food." "I'll ask Nancy," Wade said. "She's better at that kind of thing." "You know Nancy." "I do." Nancy was Wade's sister and the closest thing Ridgeland had to a walking heart. She worked at the feed store, lived above it in a one-room flat, and was known for feeding every stray she saw, including a half-blind possum she named Harold. She would understand. As Wade left, Caleb lingered at the edge of the porch, letting the cold settle on his shoulders like an old friend. Behind him he heard the faint sound of laughter. Emily's. It wasn't loud, but it was real. He hadn't heard that sound inside this cabin since the days of his son's birthday parties years before the war, before the accident, before everything froze. He stepped back inside. Emily had taken to sketching again, her notepad resting on her knee. Cooper's curled form was already half drawn in soft pencil strokes. "He's going to be okay," she said quietly. "You sure of that?" "I have to be," she answered. Someone should be. Mags, having finished her meal, leapt onto the windowsill, tail flicking ears, turning toward the gathering wind outside. The sky had dimmed to a steel gray. A storm was coming. "Do you want to stay for dinner?" Caleb asked, suddenly. Emily looked up in surprise. "Are you sure I don't offer often?" he replied. "Then I'd be silly to say no." That night, as the first flurries began to fall across the ridges of Ridgeland, a cabin once ruled by silence echoed with the clink of spoons and the hush of voices low in conversation. The puppy slept between 2 folded blankets. The cat watched from the windowsill like a sentinel carved in stone, and the girl who never feared the woods sat beside a man who'd forgotten how to let anyone in. Outside Mercy's field swayed under wind and snow, but inside warmth bloomed. Chapter 3. The House with 3 Shadows. The storm broke sometime just before dawn, not with thunder or violence, but with a soft, insistent fall of snow, quiet as breath. Outside Caleb Monroe's cabin, the trees stood sheathed in white, their skeletal branches haloed with frost. The gravel drive had disappeared under a smooth ivory blanket, and the world looked for a moment clean and untouched. From inside the living room window, it was a painting light brushing the trees like forgiveness. Inside, warmth radiated from the old cast-iron stove, its steady hum a heartbeat against the hush. Cooper lay curled near the hearth, nestled into two worn blankets that still smelled faintly of cedar and coffee. He stirred occasionally, legs twitching, eyes fluttering, but his breathing was stronger, more even than the day before. His golden coat had started to fluff out from under the grime. Though still thin, the pup now looked less like a discarded thing and more like something that might live. Mags, as was her new habit, had claimed the windowsill as her throne. Her eyes, green and unblinking, tracked the snowflakes outside, and her body remained poised, though her tail twitched occasionally, betraying her thoughts. She had not yet come farther into the house. Caleb suspected she never would not all the way. But each morning she was there. That meant something. Caleb sipped coffee from a chipped enamel mug, his back to the stove. The cabin had changed in small, almost imperceptible ways since Emily began coming around. There was a pair of pink mittens on the coat rack, a tin of peppermint tea in the cupboard, 2 extra blankets on the couch folded neatly in corners where blankets never lived before. The silence wasn't so thick anymore. That morning Emily returned with her backpack slung over one shoulder and a small canvas tote in hand. Her cheeks were red from the wind and her hair had been tugged loose from its braid by the cold. "I brought broth," she announced without ceremony, kicking snow from her boots on the porch, "and honey sticks. I read that dogs like sweet things when they're healing." Caleb raised an eyebrow as he let her in. "You read that, huh? I did," she replied confidently, unzipping her coat. "Also, my friend Maggie says so. She has a Pomeranian with IBS. She's practically a dog nutritionist. I'm sure." Emily knelt beside Cooper and began speaking to him in a voice so soft Caleb could barely hear it. She told him about her morning walk, about the deer tracks she'd seen near the creek, about how her dad had finally fixed the tractor and smelled like gasoline for 2 days. Cooper didn't understand her words, but he leaned into her hand when she stroked behind his ears. Meanwhile, Mags jumped down from the windowsill and approached the stove. Caleb, without thinking, opened a can of mackerel and placed it into the ceramic dish he'd started using for her. She sniffed, flicked her tail, and deigned to eat. Caleb watched her, the corners of his mouth twitching. "You run this place now, don't you?" he murmured. "Don't even pay rent." Later that afternoon, while Emily drew quietly by the fire, Caleb stepped into the back room, one he hadn't entered in nearly 5 years. It had once been his son's room, then a storage space, then nothing. Dust hung in the air like regret. Faded posters of baseball players still lined the wall corners curled. A desk sat askew, covered in old letters, unopened mail, and a tarnished dog tag that still bore the name David Monroe. Caleb's hand hovered over it. He didn't pick it up. Instead, he spent the next 2 hours cleaning. He rolled up the faded rug, wiped down the window pane, and cleared the clutter. At one point he found an old dog bowl with a sticker on the bottom that read, "For Ranger, no onions." He chuckled softly. Ranger had been a mutt they rescued when David was 8. The dog had lived for 12 years and died the winter before David deployed. When Emily peeked her head in later, her eyes widened. "What's this?" Caleb shrugged. "Thought I'd make a space for Cooper. And maybe the cat. She acts like she owns the hallway anyway." Emily stepped inside and ran her fingers along the windowsill. "It's a good room. It feels like someone used to love it." She looked at him, then the weight of unspoken things in her eyes. "Did they?" He nodded once. "Very much." That night Emily stayed until the sun dropped below the ridge. Her father, Graham Dalton, came to pick her up in his rust-colored Ford truck. Graham was in his early 40s, lanky, with a face that seemed more tired than weathered, a man built from long hours and quiet grief. His wife had died when Emily was 6, an aneurysm that took her in minutes. Since then, he'd raised Emily alone with hands that were always calloused and arms that never quite let go. He knocked once before entering, tipping his cap. "Hope she wasn't too much trouble." Caleb shook his head. "She runs the place now." Graham smiled faintly. "That sounds about right." Before they left, Emily turned to Caleb and said, "I think Cooper's going to need toys soon. Dogs need things to do when they get better." Then she pointed to Mags, who was currently lying on the top of the bookshelf like a tired queen. "She needs nothing. She already owns everything." After they were gone, the cabin felt quieter but not empty. Caleb walked into the back room again. He set a folded blanket on the floor and placed the bowl labeled Ranger beside it. He didn't know yet if Cooper would recover enough to claim the space, or if Mags would ever rest her head there. But he was ready. For the first time in a long while, he was ready. The wind rattled the shutters softly. Cooper stirred in his sleep. Caleb sat beside him, one hand resting gently on the dog's back. It was strange, he thought, how quickly a place could shift, not through grand acts, but through the quiet presence of others. 3 shadows lived in the cabin now, and none of them were afraid of the dark anymore. Chapter 4. The Night. Cooper. Shook the Snow returned 2 days later, soft at first like a whisper over the ridge, and then heavier piling in drifts against the porch rails and sagging branches of the pines. The whole town of Ridgeland was quiet, huddled under the weight of early winter. The cabin, though still modest and rough-edged, had begun to feel like a home again, at least to those who stayed inside it. Caleb sat at the kitchen table, an old yellow legal pad before him, a pen in hand. He hadn't written anything in years. Not a letter, not a note, not even a grocery list. But now he found himself sketching ideas for shelving places to keep pet supplies, blankets, bowls, things he never thought he'd need again. His handwriting was slow, uneven. He paused every few lines to sip lukewarm coffee and glance toward the fireplace. Cooper, now 2 weeks into his healing, was curled in his usual spot near the hearth. His coat had thickened slightly and shone under the firelight. His eyes had regained a bit of their spark, and he now followed Caleb and Emily with a quiet attentiveness, as if memorizing the rhythm of this new life. But something in his movements was still slow, stiff, especially when the weather dipped. Mags remained elusive. She slept mostly on the window ledge, and when the sun came out, she'd move to the top of the bookshelf, paws tucked under her and tail flicking like a metronome. She had accepted Caleb's presence, but not his touch. Emily was allowed to scratch under her chin barely. Mags was her own story written in claw marks and narrow escapes, and she wasn't done yet. That afternoon, Emily arrived with a new visitor. As she stomped snow from her boots, she waved to Caleb with her usual bright grin and motioned to the figure behind her. "Mr. C," she said cheerfully, "this is Molly Tate. She's a nurse at the vet clinic. She said she could help check on Cooper's leg." Molly was in her late 30s with a sturdy frame, practical boots, and a laugh that came easily even in the cold. Her copper-colored hair was pulled into a bun, and she wore a deep green parka dusted with flakes. She held a small medical bag in one gloved hand. "Hope you don't mind," she said. "Emily flagged me down while I was getting feed from the supply store. Said you had a pup that could use a look." Caleb nodded, stepping back to let her in. "He's resting. Legs still stiff, but he's eating." "That's a good sign," Molly replied as she crossed the room and knelt beside Cooper. Her touch was practiced, efficient, but kind. "Hello, handsome," she murmured as she examined his joints, gently stretching and flexing. "You've had a rough go, haven't you?" Cooper looked up at her with tired but trusting eyes. He didn't protest the examination. Caleb watched from the doorway, arms crossed, unsure why a stranger in his home made him feel like the walls had shifted. Molly gave her report after 10 minutes. No sign of infection. Healing well, but he'll need gentle exercise soon. Some warmth massage therapy if you're up for it. If not, I can come back on the weekends. Caleb hesitated. "You do house calls for strays?" Molly smiled. "I do favors for Emily, and besides, a cabin like this beats my clinic's fluorescent lights." That night the storm rolled in stronger. Snow beat against the windows in thick sheets, and the power flickered twice before giving out altogether. Caleb lit the oil lamps, their glow casting long shadows on the wood-paneled walls. Cooper began pacing restlessly. He didn't bark, he rarely did, but he whined low in his throat and wouldn't settle near the fire. Caleb placed a hand on his back. "Easy," he murmured. "It's just wind." But it wasn't. Around midnight, Cooper began to tremble. At first, it seemed like a reaction to the cold. Caleb stoked the fire higher, pulled another blanket over him. Still, the trembling grew worse. The pup's body began to twitch erratically, and his eyes rolled slightly, the whites showing. His breath turned shallow, rapid. Mags leapt down from her perch with a screech, not of fear but of alarm, and bolted across the room to Cooper's side. She yowled once, sharp and urgent, her tail bristling. Caleb, jolted, fully awake, scrambled for his medical kit stored in the bedroom closet, still packed from his last deployment all those years ago. His hands shook as he injected the anti-fever shot into the loose skin of Cooper's neck. He whispered steadily, "Come on, boy. Come on." Emily had taught him that Cooper liked being called good, even when he didn't move. So Caleb repeated it. "Good boy. Stay. You're doing so good." The seizure lasted nearly 3 minutes. It felt like a lifetime. Then Cooper sagged his breathing shallow but steady. Mags sat beside him, her head nudging his ear gently like a silent promise. Caleb didn't move for a long time. His knees ached, his back screamed, but his hand never left Cooper's chest. When the trembling stopped, he whispered, "You're not going yet. You've just gotten here." In the morning, the power still hadn't returned, but the snow had stopped. The cabin was cold, but not silent. Emily arrived with fresh batteries and a thermos of hot cider. She found Caleb asleep in the armchair, one hand draped over Cooper, who slept soundly beneath 3 blankets. Mags was curled on top, one paw resting protectively over Cooper's back. Emily didn't speak. She just moved quietly around the kitchen, lit the stove, and waited. Chapter 5. The porch light stays on. By the time the snow began to melt, Ridgeland had slipped into the cusp of December. The days were still short, but there were hours now between mid-morning and mid-afternoon when the sun warmed the treetops and turned the slush to steam. The fields around Mercy's Ridge glistened like silver coins scattered on pale earth, and the dirt road leading to Caleb Monroe's cabin had begun to reveal its old ruts and gravel bones. Inside the cabin, life was shifting from recovery to rhythm. Cooper was standing now, still a little wobbly, but with more confidence in his steps. His gait had a faint drag on the back left leg, but his tail wagged in slow arcs, and his appetite had grown nearly reckless. His golden coat, once matted and dull, now shimmered in the lamplight, thick and soft. He had the tentative energy of something reborn. At night, he slept on the rug near the hearth. During the day, he followed Caleb and Emily from room to room like a shadow with paws. Mags, the storm-gray cat, had become a permanent fixture. She roamed the house as if she'd always owned it, slipping through narrow spaces and perching on high corners. She rarely spoke, but she watched everything. She never missed Cooper's feeding Caleb's quiet rituals or Emily's laughter. It was as if she'd taken on the role of silent guardian, and in some ways she had. One Thursday afternoon, Emily brought something wrapped in a brown paper bag. She handed it to Caleb by the stove with a small grin. "I made this with my dad." Caleb unwrapped it. Inside was a carved wooden sign, the letters burnt into the grain with careful hands. "This house belongs to the brave." Caleb looked at her. "You made this?" "Well," Emily admitted, brushing flour from her jacket. "I helped. Dad did the carving. I picked the words." Caleb ran his fingers over the lettering, the grooves rough under his calloused skin. "Thank you," he said, voice quiet. They hung it beside the door that night, just beneath the porch light that had until recently gone unused. On Saturday, the doorbell rang. It was rare anyone rang, rarer still that someone found their way to the cabin without prior warning. Caleb answered with the familiar unease of a man who had learned to expect only trouble. But it wasn't trouble. On the porch stood a woman in her 60s, bundled in a burgundy wool coat, her silver hair twisted into a tight braid beneath a navy beanie. She held a foil-covered tray in one hand and a canvas tote in the other. Her eyes, ice blue and sharp, were warm with recognition. "Nancy Cooper," she introduced herself. "Wade's sister." Nancy had a face like a weathered quilt, lined soft and gently worn from years of service and smiles. She was the type who never knocked twice, because she believed if you didn't hear her the first time, you probably needed her more than you knew. "I brought some supplies," she said, stepping inside without waiting. "Kibble heating pads and 2 good combs. Also meatloaf." "Don't argue. I know you haven't cooked a proper meal in at least a month." Caleb blinked. "How do you Wade talks when he's worried?" "And Wade's been talking a lot lately." Nancy moved through the cabin like she'd lived there in another life, unpacking, adjusting fluffing blankets and clucking at the dust. Mags observed her with mild distaste from atop the kitchen cabinet. Cooper, however, was enamored. He followed her closely, tail wagging, head tilted as she spoke to him like a grandchild. "I heard you had a bit of a scare last week," Nancy said, handing Caleb a hot cup of cider. "Seizure." He nodded. "Fever spiked." almost lost him. "You didn't," she said, "and that counts for something." Later that evening, after Nancy had left, Caleb stood on the porch watching the light flicker against the snowbanks. Emily sat cross-legged in the living room showing Cooper how to tug on an old knotted rope. Mags batted at a feather toy she would later pretend not to like. "I'm thinking of putting in a gate," Caleb said out loud. "Not to anyone in particular, not to keep anything out. Just to mark the place." Emily looked up. "Like a front gate." "Yeah. Maybe a mailbox, too. You don't get mail. Maybe it's time I did." That weekend news of Cooper's rescue had begun to circulate beyond just the feed store or Nancy's whispers. Emily, with permission, had posted a drawing to the town's online community board, a sketch of Cooper curled beside Mags with the cabin in the background and the words, "The porch light stays on." People responded. Messages came in quiet ones at first. Offers of blankets, pet food, donations. A retired carpenter named Jerry, who lived alone with a three-legged dachshund named Spud, offered to build a dog ramp for the porch. A woman named Trish, who ran the town's general store, sent over a basket of treats and 2 handmade collars. But it wasn't just about things. One message read, "My son hasn't smiled in weeks. He saw your drawing, Emily. He asked if cats and dogs really stay with people when they're hurting. I told him sometimes they're the ones who stay the longest." Caleb read that one 3 times before folding it gently and placing it in the drawer beside his bed. The next week, a reporter from the Ridgeland Post called, asked if they could do a story. Caleb declined, but Emily didn't. She spoke softly on the phone, explained how Mags had found Cooper, how Caleb had opened his door, and how a house that once kept the world out had begun to let the world back in. The article ran the next Sunday. It was titled, "The House That Didn't Give Up." Caleb taped a copy to the fridge, and that evening, for the first time in many, many years, he left the porch light on. Not for himself, but in case someone else out there was looking for a place where broken things weren't thrown away. Not every rescue begins with a siren. Sometimes it begins with a trembling paw, a pair of watching eyes, or a porch light left on just in case. This story wasn't just about a puppy who almost didn't make it. It was about a cat who chose to stay, a girl who refused to walk away, and a man who opened his door not just to a dog, but to healing. Maybe you've been like Caleb, guarded, grieving, unsure if there's anything left worth letting in. Maybe you felt like Cooper, broken, left behind, wondering if anyone will see your worth. Or maybe you're like Mags, the silent one who watches, who's been hurt too many times to trust, but still stays when it matters. Wherever you are in your journey, let this remind you. Sometimes what heals us isn't loud or bright. It's quiet, it's patient, and it often wears fur. If this story stirred something in you, share it with someone who might need a light left on. Leave a comment with the word "Amen" if you believe that even the most forgotten lives can still find their way home. And if you believe in kindness, second chances, and the quiet ways God still works, subscribe to our channel to help us share more stories like this one. May God bless you wherever you are, whoever you're saving, or whoever's saving you.